Hello, friends, and welcome back to another episode of Seeds of Liberation, our podcast about justice and faith. I'm Pastor Lindsay Anderson and my colleague, Pastor Michael Johnson. We are here as always, but we are joined tonight by two very special guests. It's a family affair, y'all. So my father, Thomas Anderson, and one of Pastor Johnson's beautiful daughters, Taylor Johnson, are our guests today. Hey, fam.
Hi.
Thanks for being with us. And we are here with some members of our family because we want to have a special conversation about some Black family dynamics. So hold on tight, y'all. As many of you will know, last month in the media, on the social media, in the Twitterverse, there was a huge blow up around gospel singer Kirk Franklin and some audio recording that was released by his son, in which his son highlighted or posted that his father was threatening him and using very violent language against him. And the section of the audio that was shared was that and shared that. And we're not, and then of course there was fallout in every direction and everyone had opinions. And you know, some people busted out their old Stomp albums and were like, Kirk Franklin forever. Some people were like, y'all are enabling this bad dynamic and this abuse that happens in our families, this violence. And we don't really want to get into that. That's not what we're here to talk about. But that incident brought again to the fore this conversation about physical violence and violent speech and punishment in Black families and how we carry that and how that is culturally normed, right? We're not saying that every family works in the same way or has the same standards of discipline or punishment, but that it's a norm in our community and that's something we need to talk about. So we're going to talk about it tonight. We're gonna talk about it. And to keep us honest, Pastor Johnson and I invited some folks from our family who are part of navigating that punishment norm or have been in the past. That some folks call whoopins. In my house, we called it spankings because my mama is white. But you know, there's a lot of different ways of naming what we're talking about. And before we start, I do want to just give a little side note commercial to our white listeners and viewers. Hi, y'all. Welcome. This conversation is not about you and it's not for you. It's for the Black community, but we're going to have it in front of you. And we invite you to listen and learn and to reflect on the ways that much of this conversation is rooted in the trauma that was caused by chattel slavery and that continues to be exacerbated by whiteness. So I'm glad you're here. I want you to listen. I'm not really interested in your comments below. And this is not a conversation for you to engage, but to listen. So with that said, Pastor Johnson, do you want to help us dig in a little deeper to what we're talking about?
I'll take a stab at it. Oh my God. Well, you know, I'm a baby boomer. So I was raised, you know, whoop that butt, spare the rod, spoil the child. Oh Lord. You know, I thought getting a good whooping was a badge of honor. And we were raised that punishment and that beating was the best way to raise a child so that they would do well. But we have to admit, as Pastor just alluded to, that, you know, this whole notion of whooping in order to control our children, is something that we inherited from chattel slavery. I mean, we have to go back to the slave household, to the plantation, and the Willie Lynch letter, that outlines very well the divide between the generations, the divide between light skin, dark skin, house Negro, field Negro, and old folk and younger folk. And so mother, unfortunately, had the task in a lot of our households of being the heavy to deliver the punishment. And Lord knows that I use that mode. Can we talk, y'all? I gotta be honest, because I'm gonna brag later that I did not beat my daughters per se, though I got one with me. She gonna, but I did allow it, and I did think that it was it was something that should be done. And instead of doing it myself, of course, well, I delegated to my wife. And so, of course, again, we use, women are used again in a negative light. And even on the slave plantation, women were the ones who were supposed to keep the children in line, to control them, to make sure that they were good Negroes, so that they wouldn't shame the household and be bad slaves. Well, fast forward to today, and we still trying to be good Negroes in a white racist society, if we're going to be honest about it. And especially in upper middle class or middle class Black families, where we're really trying to keep up with the Joneses, so to speak. So you can't embarrass us with that bad behavior. And we got to admit that a lot of us believe that the downfall of public education is that we don't get to take that big stick off the wall that we used to call the Board of Education and beat the hell out of our children. Beat them into submission, because you got a mind, right? I mean, you got a mind. And if you don't mind, because we're not creative in our households, we got to use the stick. So, and sometimes we were so incredibly horrible in our households, we would even make the child go pick their instrument of execution, right? I mean, you better go out there and give me a stick, and don't get no small stick, boy, or I'm gonna go get a log. And we'll be with it. And so all of this stuff just has historic ramifications, but just incredible. And so we're just offering, this historical viewpoint. We're not here to try to tell you what to do in your household. Okay, we just want to share mainly our stories and our history, but yeah, this is all rooted in slavery. It's rooted in white racism. It's rooted in internalized racial oppression. And so we're here to talk about it and kick it with you a little bit tonight. And we got some guests with us. Amen.
Right. And just to everything, that was a lot that you just said, Pastor Johnson. And well said. And I'm just struck by how painful and soul destroying that position is for mothers, but really for all parents, right? That in chattel slavery, to be put in a position where you need to beat your children into submission because the other alternative is that they would be murdered with not a second thought, right? What a terrible, soul crushing position to be put in. And then to let that live in our psyche for generations, right? Because it's still the same position, right? Black parents aren't here beating their children because they're hateful, right? Most of them, you know, we got some hateful folks too, but most folks are doing that so they don't go, their kids don't go out in the streets and become the victim of police murder, right? So they don't go out in the streets and somehow fall into the hands of white supremacists because they went somewhere that they weren't supposed to go, or spoke up, or looked like they whistled at a white woman, right? It's all this compounding years and years and years of being put in that impossible position. And how over generations are we supposed to judge, like, what is enough bodily violence for me to inflict? Right? Like, what's enough and what's too much? Well, that's all of that is still rooted in this idea that our bodies need to experience violence in the world, right? Which is a teaching, an anti-Blackness teaching, that Black bodies were made to be beaten, that Black bodies were made to be controlled. And so I think part of the tension that we want to wrestle with is that unknowingly, in many generations before this, we pass that trauma on by teaching our children that their bodies didn't belong to them, right? That there was always an outside presence who could determine what happened to their body. And they better just be thankful that it was a person who birthed them. But that still sets up this expectation, right? That my body is not my own, that at any moment, violence can be enacted on my body by an outside force. And that's what we have to wrestle with. This isn't about like, you're a bad parent, you're a good parent, I'm following the teachings of the Bible. Nah. Because the Christian gospel is never going to okay the degradation of a human body. God is embodied in our bodies. We believe that, we teach that, right? So anyone who's following Jesus, we need to wrestle with what we allow to happen to our divinely given bodies.
Amen. Y'all weigh on in now. Let's hear from you. Yes.
I'm going to weigh in here because my experience was a bit different. There was definitely the old rule of spare the rod, spoil the child, and there were not many rods spared at the house. And most of them were worn out on me. But it wasn't for that reason. It was never explained to us that way. It was just, do not embarrass me, especially if you're out in public or somebody was over visiting and you embarrassed dad. You would get punished right there in front of whoever it was. You didn't get excused to the other room. You didn't wait till the company went away, or you were in the store and they didn't take you to the car. You got it right then and there. So it was never explained that way. It was just that you needed to respect your elders. Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am. No, sir. No, no, ma'am. And that's the way it was. And another piece of that, I'm old enough now that things slip in and slip out, and I don't remember where I was going. But my dad had this, and he was the heavy. That's the other thing. It wasn't mother. He was the heavy, and that's what we called it. And I, in turn, was the same, to the extent that I was the punisher. I was the main guy. Now that didn't mean that Mom, Lindsay's mother, didn't handle it, because she wasn't one who said, "Okay, wait till your father gets home," kind of thing. at least not directly, but we at least had talked about that and tried not to do those kinds of things. But I was the main heavy in that regard, and that's kind of the way I was raised. So, um, but I just wanted to throw that in there that the reasons weren't put there. It always was more of a scriptural thing, and I don't even know for sure. And you pastors can probably tell me for sure not, but I don't think that spare the rod and spoil the child is in the Bible, is it? Is one of those things that was attributed to, but not really there?
It is there actually. Actually,
Oh,
in the book of Proverbs, there's a proverb that says, "Those who spare the rod hate their children.
okay.
Those who love their children um, give diligent discipline."
Okay.
However,
Well, that.
however, friends, um, I am so tired of people pulling out a proverb, which is like, to me, when you separate and pull it out, it feels like you're reading a fortune cookie. Because right after, 2 verses after that verse, there's a proverb that says, "A wise woman builds her house, while the foolish tear their own house down with their own hands." Right? There are so many teachings that if you cherry pick them, you can use them for whatever side of the argument you want. There are so many things that are contextual to a time and place. Proverbs represents a set of wisdom that we receive from ancient people who were part of a nomadic people that lived in the Middle East, right? Our lives are a little bit different. That doesn't mean it can't tell us some things about human nature, about God, right? But that one verse, I mean, ain't nobody pulling out the, "If your child talks back to you, you should stone them to death" from Deuteronomy. I mean, I don't want to give anyone permission, but come on.
Always taught too that you can't take a verse away from the whole. You can't take a verse and interpret it without the rest of the Bible. And that's what people do irresponsibly. But Taylor, why don't you jump on in here? We want to hear from the younger generation here for a second.
Well, yeah, you guys definitely covered a lot, but I had some stuff written down right here. Just the mother was the punisher and everything. I think that that definitely played out a lot in our house, specifically. Not so much mother was the punisher, but you know, she did do most of the disciplining, specifically with me, because I am the youngest, and now that I'm older, you know, I do realize that I probably caused my parents most of their gray hairs, and I know that now. um, but it's just, it was always, you know, interesting seeing, because I think for me, it wasn't so much the actual act of, you know, being punished. It was like the anticipation of it, especially when it was like, when it involved my dad. Because for me, you know, he touched on this earlier, but he never really, you know, put his hands on us or disciplined us in that way. For me, it was the voice was enough to put us in line, or, you know, to make us correct whatever it was we were in trouble for. So, you know, it was always the anticipation of, you know, waiting for dad to come home and knowing that he was gonna, he was he was gonna say something to us, and it was gonna make us feel, you know, that we needed to get ourselves together. So that was something that sort of stood out to me. But yeah.
Dads with deep voices. Oof.
Yeah.
Well, you know, and of course I knew that, you know, a lot of times with my daughters, I mean, after I, just raised the voice an octave, I mean, it was kind of like a whooping. I mean, when the tears came, and I'm a big softy anyway. So I'm like, but I guess I need to say this, that for me, it's funny. I grew up, my mother was a stern disciplinarian. I mean, if you do it, you getting your butt whooped. I mean, there's no, she didn't wait for daddy. She didn't, pain, behavior, consequences. But I mean, but she held our family together. But and I grew up appreciating that. I was like, hey, she was right, but for some reason, I could not do that with my daughters. For some reason, my logic was, because I was thinking of the boys that they would encounter. And my logic was, I can't tell them to not let someone put their hands on them if I'm putting my hands on them. That's, I just, it does, and then they, and people, and I know I'm going to get in trouble for this one, but, we're taught that the way that we're raised is the way that we'll be. And there is some truth in that. I mean, we've been, hey, I know I've been to therapy, and my therapist said, we're survivors of our childhoods. Pastor Anderson remembers that when we went to therapy together, when we were going to pastor together. And I thought that struck me that the therapist said that, but she was saying, she alluded to the fact that, this pride I had in the way my mother whooped me was dysfunctional. And really, okay, but I witnessed that violence. I came up in it, and people say you're going to pass that on, and I've never put my hands on my wife. Now, I'm not saying I didn't get angry, but I never put my hands on my wife, and I've never put my hands on my children. And so sometimes we have to just own that the things that we do are, even though we may be socialized into a way, ultimately, we all have to take responsibility for our actions and what we do.
And go ahead, Dave.
I was just going to say a little follow-up on my part was that I never questioned the process. I thought that's the way it was supposed to be, and heard stories, of course, from my dad regarding how they were treated as children and growing up. And mother, she would punish us too, but it was like maybe Lindsay might say, there was a world of difference between mother's punishment and dad's punishment. But the thing with me was, I might get punished by mother, or if I was in school and a teacher punished me, once I got home, I got another punishment. And
that's right.
Dad would punctuate what had already happened. and it usually always was physical. We never sought out sticks, but he did have a double, the old razor strap, a double one. And Pastor Johnson, you probably know what a double razor strap is. They whip their razors on it, the old straight razor.
Yes, sir.
Nice big piece of leather, looked like a belt, but two of them hanging side by side. That was his weapon of choice, I'll say. And you laid across the bed, and he would apply it. And that was the biggest punishment, and that was very dreaded when you got called. It was just painful, and if you had to go in the room and wait for him to come, like you said, Taylor, that anticipation.
Anticipation.
Painful.
That kind of hurts more than the
Oh,
actual,
it was terrible.
just knowing that you know what's about to come, you
Yeah.
know.
It's like psychological warfare.
Hmm.
So when I got to my being the father and the punishment, I didn't question that that process was wrong, but my wife did, and she put a lot of um, knowledge. I'm gonna say it that way. Some might call it breaks, but I'm gonna say knowledge because you can still hear me. But
But
into it, and it began to make sense that she said, we don't believe in corporal punishment," is the way she first said it, and my first thought was, well, I'm not trying to kill him. I'm just gonna whip him. And she said, no, I didn't say. Um,
Capital.
I said corporal punishment, not capital punishment.
right. But now it's interesting with all these scenarios, and all of us, I mean, my family was a church family. I mean,
Yes.
my mother made, she might have had the belt in one hand, but the cross was in the other. I mean, we were in church every Sunday. I mean, she put us, she made sure that we, came forward. And then even when we fell away, I mean, she was always still a very spiritual woman. But now what do we do with all that in the way that we're raised and with the Bible that says, for God so loved the world, and the whole notion that Jesus said to his disciples, they shall know you if you're my disciple, if you're following me. The way they will know you, not by how thick your strap is, not by how big your gun is, not by how many whelps are on your daughter's butt, but they will know you by your love for each other. And so how do we unpack all of this in light of a God that is incredibly distinguished in the opposite direction? I mean, and not to say that God was not one that did not administer punishment, but there was always grace. There was always the whole notion of God stepping in and giving, as well as whatever we would call punishment. I mean, but the whole notion of grace and love is just as prominent in the Old Testament as it is in the New Testament. I mean, there was always God coming back and forgiving the Israelites every time they messed up. I mean, that was more of the bigger message. You messed up, but you're still mine. I still love you.
Mm-hmm.
And so what do we do with all of that?
Yeah, well, and Pastor, I'm just gonna throw a wrench in. But even our teaching about God being a punishing God, right? About the punishment of sin being upon Jesus, and God needed there to be a payment for the sin, and that's why Jesus came. We call it atonement theology or substitutionary atonement, right?
Yeah.
That's what people say God meant, right? That's what church fathers who were creating these theologies at the same time that they were creating systemic punishments for Black and brown bodies, for women's bodies, right? That's what these church fathers say the cross meant.
Right.
And I'm not saying that I know for sure that that's not true. I'm not saying that's not what God was doing, but I'm saying sometimes the way we talk about the moment of the cross looks a lot more like people than it looks like the God I know. And so I think we get really out of balance, and we don't wrestle enough with that interpretation of what the cross meant. And we, go through services or sermons or Sunday school lessons that are all about punishment. And we just spend a little time on the idea of a God that was healing, a God that was liberating, that was an act of love. And so I think that's part of the problem too, because in the history of Christianity, we've created theologies to justify our actions instead of creating theologies that are wrestling with the true actions of God. And so I think you're right on to bring up that point about, do we believe that God is love or do we not? And what about what we've learned matches up with that, and what has tension? And that doesn't mean we get rid of the tension, but we got to spend more time thinking about and talking about
tension. Yep. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And it's incredible too, because I mean, we're in a denomination that says that we are justified by grace through faith.
Yep.
And I know how many sermons I've heard on grace. And we're in a community where, the average pulpit preaches a whole lot about fire and brimstone, punishment. We're preaching about it. And I remember when I first became a pastor, my minister of music, not Pastor Val, this is at another church, but she said to me something really incredible. She said, "Pastor, you preach too much about love." And I was, and she, I got, "Pastor, can I meet with you for a minute? I need to go in your office. I mean, can we talk?" And she just, "You're not talking about sin enough." And I said, and I looked at her and I said, "Minister, I can only preach about God in the way that I've experienced God."
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I experience God as a God of love, as a God of second chances, of a God of grace. I don't experience God as someone who beats me down and reminds me of my shortcomings.
Yeah. And I think one of the embodiments of godly love, or one of the places where I feel like does look like God, is when we're able to look back at our parents and our grandparents and our elders and view them both in a loving way, and also an informed, knowledgeable way, right? So I don't think any of us on this call would say, I do not love my parents. They harmed me, right? They wrecked my life, and for some people that's true, right? Some people have very conflicted experiences with their parents. But one of the things that I think is gracious in the way that God is gracious is understanding that our ancestors and our parents were carrying trauma. They were carrying brokenness that was not their fault, that they did not choose, that was put on them by an inhumane, evil system, right?
Amen. Yes.
Even baby boomers, right? Even my parents, even your parents, Taylor, right? We're all living in this world that is traumatizing, and folks are living out of that trauma, and being able to hold that understanding with some love and compassion, which doesn't mean that if your parents hurt you, it's okay. It doesn't mean that if your parents really did truly do inappropriate things to you that you even have to forgive them, right? It just means recognizing the reality of their humanity. That to me teaches me a lot more about what God is like, than just this idea that everything my parents did was absolutely right, and this unquestioning, right? And I think that that's part of what I would rather focus on in this conversation, instead of like, they were wrong, what you're doing is wrong, how, you're bad parents, right? But part of this story too, in a lot of our families, is that in every generation we get better. That part of Black culture is not just this embodied trauma, but also this ethic of like, when we know better, we do better, right? And helping our children, helping the next generation to get to a better place. And so I know, Dad, in our family, we have sort of these stories that are really horrible, and to me as a child were terrifying to hear about how parents before me disciplined their children, right? Like how granddad was treated when he was a kid, or how cousin so-and-so was treated by his father. But they're like diminishing returns, right? So in every generation, it's a degree less, because parents are learning things from their own experience to say, okay, I need to keep my kid in line, but I'm definitely not gonna beat them with a hose because I saw what that looked like, and that's not right. I got to keep my kid in line, but the rule I'm going to use is I don't ever hit them with something that leaves a mark, right? And that might seem like a small thing from the outside, but I think that's actually really healing and empowering. To me, that's a legacy of healing that I get to join now, right? Because in every generation, my ancestors were doing the work to get better, to heal a little bit.
And having said that,
Yeah.
oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Taylor.
I was just gonna say something that I was sort of thinking about was when my dad talked about in you guys' therapy session, about how my grandma disciplined my dad, and how that should have affected him in certain ways, and growing up it should have affected him. But I think something that we forget, we focus on like the aspects of discipline and that event, but we never talk about like the lessons in between. And I feel as if that's what really sticks with me, not necessarily disciplining and the act of beating on your child, but what are the lessons that you're teaching your children in between that are going to stick with them? Because I think that's what I really remember from my childhood is the things that my parents taught me, in between the discipline. And I think that's what makes you into the person that you are today, is just the things that they teach you, as opposed to the things that they, put on you in a sense. So yeah, that just sort of stuck out to me too. So yeah.
That's powerful too, Taylor, because the issue too is you're teaching all the time. Even when you don't think you're teaching, you're teaching. I mean, and so that's a powerful point. Yes.
Yeah, and my memories of my nanny, my dad's mom, she was always, teaching. Even when I was around, she was always teaching. So I know that in between, each discipline, she was gonna teach him a lesson about something that he needed to know. So
and that's powerful, Taylor, because and thank you for saying that, because it I've got a bachelor's degree, a master's degree, and I'm working on a third degree, and I've encountered a lot of people, but my mother is the wisest person that I have ever met in my life. I mean, she's no longer with us, but I would always go to her before I did anything and asked her what she thought. And I miss that wisdom. And so, I really appreciate you bringing that forward. Amen.
Yeah. The one thing I was going to say that was in line with what Lindsay was saying earlier, part of it anyway, is the kind of transitioning and coming forward generation to generation with regards to our softening or tailoring our punishments. As grandfather, my dad's father, um, his style was very abrupt, like just as an example, which I believe she was inferring to at one point, was one of the brothers spoke back to him, and this brother, dad was right about 6 foot, and all the others were taller than he was. Granddad was there or a little more, had to look up to this brother. And when he butt back spoke, as Granddad thought he was doing, Granddad just picked up a block of wood and just hit him right upside the head and knocked him to the floor. And he laid there with blood coming out of his mouth and ear. And Granddad just told him, disrespect me, now we'll kill you if you in this house. And that's how strong it was in those days. My dad was not that way. His softening was, he always believed that he punished you, but he would choose a punish or a strap or something that could not, or in his mind or opinion, it couldn't be anything that would hurt you internally. He just wanted to, as he would say, smart the skin so you'd remember. And he always would say too, you didn't turn them loose until they went flaccid. If they still had starch, as he called it, in them, and they were bucking against you, you kept laying it on them. Once they went flaccid, then you got them under, you broke them. In other words,
oh Lord,
and that was his philosophy, and I agree with Taylor though, with regards to looking back at a lot of that, and then looking at some of my cousins that are even younger than me, who still follow that pattern of punishment with their children. How that doesn't really change the thing. You learn fear, you learn not to do some things again, but it doesn't really teach you. And it's the other lessons that teach you. And then sometimes observing these other things, and in my case, kind of taught me how to tailor my punishment to a softer, better way of handling things, along again with, and I mean this very seriously, a lot of that input came from Gail, my wife, Lindsay's mother, learning the new way or a better way of handling those things and doing better because you know better, kind of thing, as you say.
Right. Well, and there are so many reasons why I feel very grateful to have been raised by a teacher. But that's one of them, that educators understand how we help children.
And that would be the wife.
What?
That would be the wife, not me as the teacher.
Yeah. Well, you were a different kind of educator, and I'm also grateful for that. I do think that a theme that I just want to name, since we already made people mad by talking about whoopins and then talking about interpretations of the cross, let's just go for a hat trick.
The trifecta.
Yeah, the trifecta. To say that I think one of the things that our stories on this podcast have in common is both you, Dad, and you, Pastor Johnson, have been to therapy and have done your own internal work. And that's really important. That's really, and not because y'all were more crazy than anybody else, not because like you needed a intervention on some kind, like, I think people imagine that like folks who go to therapy have like a wild, traumatic, something bad is happening, right? But the idea that all of us can benefit from being in therapy, from learning what to do with our emotions, some of those stories from our family are not just about the external pressure that racism was putting on parents, but they're about the internal hurts that they didn't know how to process, right? If you're willing to kill your child because they disrespect you, there's something not right about your own security and vision and understanding of who you are, right? And therapy can help you work that out. Therapy can make you a better parent, better child, better human, better believer in the Lord. So that ends my commercial for going to therapy. But I do think that's a really a key theme in both of your stories about how you chose to discipline and parent your children.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, yep. I say amen, amen.
Mhm.
You are not crazy if you go to therapy.
Go
Good.
And also something that stuck out that Pastor Anderson just said about respect is just why does respect, when it comes to disciplining your child, like why does that have to come in the form of like you have to respect me, so I'm gonna beat it into you respect? Like why can't you just have that conversation with your child, like we should have mutual respect for each other.
Amen.
But also your child should want to look up to you as a person of, I'm going to respect my parent because they've done XYZ, not because they've beat me or disciplined me in this way, so that just stuck out to me too.
Yeah, using fear as a tool, as opposed to love as a tool.
Yeah.
But that again comes from the plantation.
Right.
I should have said, well, we know why, but that just stuck out to me. So.
Yeah.
Right. Right. Well, and so I think that callback, Pastor Johnson, to remind us that this journey, this wrestling in our own families, this healing, and trying to reconcile our growing up with our parents and how we're living with the next generation, that's all the work of anti-racism. That is all part of resisting the system of racism that we're living in. It's all part of taking apart the legacy of anti-Blackness and chattel slavery. And it's justice. It's part of the justice work that Jesus calls us to.
Amen.
So I hope, friends who are out there listening, that you heard us say that we're struggling with this too. We're on a journey too. We're giving thanks for our victories and trying to heal from our losses. And what we want is not for you to feel ashamed or for you to blame the folks in your family, but for you to join us on this journey and to do your own work around the traumas that you're carrying and healing that God desires for you.
Amen.
Amen.
I think you can have the last word, Pastor. As we wrap this one up, we thank our guests,
Yes.
Mr. Thomas Anderson and Ms. Taylor Johnson, for joining us. And join us again, beloved, next week for another episode of Seeds of Liberation.
Right. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you.